Hello everybody, my name is Reese Lundmark and welcome to another edition of Creating a Humanist Blockchain Future, where we focus on the intersection of effective altruism, universal basic income, the attention economy, and blockchain. And today we're going to focus on the attention economy and kind of two aspects of it. First, the kind of consumption side, and then second, the kind of creation side, the where do you spend your time side. And on the consumption side, we're going to focus a lot on this kind of fire hose of information within the blockchain space. How should we deal with this fire hose of information? What does the signal to noise look like there? And also, how can we kind of scaffold other people into this space more easily? So that's one side of things. And on the other side of things, we're going to talk about the kind of value creation side. And another thing that we've seen in this space is, how can we not duplicate work? How can we minimize waste and be more interoperable and be more cooperative and collaborative? So those are going to be the two things we're focusing on. And kind of before we dive in, I want to talk from a culture perspective around kind of the culture and the context that we're in here that kind of informs a lot of my thinking around this kind of consumption and creation piece. So the culture that we're in is this, it's a blockchain-y culture, and it's a pretty strong one. So many people in the space kind of start with why, and they start with why both from the kind of, cypherpunk, decentralize the world, distrust in centralized institutions perspective, but there's also some of this kind of, by nature, that decentralization also has a kind of do good and kind of a lessening inequality piece. And you can see this with Balaji's recent article on quantifying decentralization. And to quantify it, he used the Gini coefficient, which is the same coefficient to look at inequality. So this is to say that this new kind of culture that we're in is one that is very decentralized-y and very kind of anti-status quo, but it's also one that's surprisingly pro-people and surprisingly kind of do-gooder. And, as a result of that do-gooder piece, you have, this piece on inequality, and right now, 8 of the top 8 people in the world have more wealth than the bottom 50 combined, and that's kind of intense. And because of that, you can start to think about these metrics that we're kind of optimizing for in this space. And when we're optimizing for these metrics, one metric that we used to have, but that doesn't really matter as much anymore, is the kind of dollars for self piece. And this is because if you're trying to get lots and lots of dollars for yourself, well, that's kind of centralized by nature, and that's kind of anti-decentralization. And so that doesn't really make sense. It also doesn't really make too much sense in this world where we're transitioning out of a world where capital is scarce. And for me, the great example of this is, for me, I can make a good amount of money coding or coaching or doing whatever, and but after $45,000, that money has diminishing or no returns on my happiness. And so if I'm optimizing for happiness, which I generally am, after 45,000 bucks, I can essentially stop taking that money and distribute it back to the system. So that's kind of a good example of this world where capital was scarce, but it's less scarce, where I don't need to take in all the capital and money that I am kind of that I'm providing to the world through value. So this is to say that these metrics that we're working with aren't necessarily just dollars for self, but they can be things that are more like outcomes for society. So this can be, did we increase people's quality of life, or did we save some lives? Did we increase the amount of people that have access to a financial system? Things like that are some of the metrics that I've seen people use in this space that might not be as classically used in systems where capital was not scarce, where centralization and kind of money for self was still such a big thing. So given that, and given those metrics, what those metrics essentially say is, well, we're going to have to, if we're optimizing for this metric, which is, a kind of shared outcome metric, then we can think more about that shared outcome and less about just the dollars for self. And so that kind of encourages some of these, like the collaboration and the interoperability, and some of those things are even needed in the space. And you see so many people kind of collaborating across multiple different industries, multiple different companies in the blockchain space, because it's both part of our mindset and because it's kind of needed. So, when I think about this kind of shared outcome thing, I'm reminded a lot of Zuko and what he said in his piece on why he's advising Tezos. So he said, essentially, as a quote, "The network is bigger than any particular cryptocurrency. The network is all cryptocurrencies. In fact, the network is much bigger than that. The network is of all scientific and economic activity of all of this planet's people." And I think that's beautiful, and I think that that's true. That when people say, "Hey, Zuko, why are you advising Tezos? They're kind of a pseudo competitor." It's like, look, the goal is just this big network, and we're all kind of complementary with each other, and we're all just trying to make a better world. So if I advise them and they do a great job, that's awesome because I'm part of this big network of people as well. So that kind of mindset is really in the space, and I think a thing that we can't lose sight of though is that we have this mindset piece, which is, oh man, do good, decentralize the world, whatever. But we also have this the technology piece, and the kind of self-reinforcing loop. There's a self-reinforcing loop between the two, where you have technology, the blockchain technology, which enables us to think in these new ways. That kind of enables us to change our mindset, and our mindset changes, giving us new, us creating new technology that's in this kind of self-reinforcing loop where we're kind of pushing for more and more decentralization around shared outcomes rather than kind of an old system, and we're doing that both from a mindset perspective but also from a technology perspective. And another way I think about this is kind of like we as a kind of a human organism or as a human group need to kind of turn ourselves into a system that can be optimized and can be easily leveraged with blockchain. So, as we start to think in these ways, it will kind of, the blockchain technology essentially turns that system, makes us create a system on ourselves that blockchain can actually use. So, given that, I think about this technology and society thing, and the quote that Naval often uses for this, and he's quoting Snow Crash, he says, this Snow Crash thing, is it a virus, a drug, or a religion? And it's all three. It's a virus in that it's a piece of technology, and it's a drug/religion in that it's a mindset. And these two things all kind of, they have a loop with each other that kind of pushes us forward. So that's kind of the context that we're in, is this new decentralize the world for good mindset. And given that, let's talk about the kind of consumption side and then the creation side. So on the consumption side, and I think the consumption-creation dichotomy is actually a wrong one, and we're going to be talking a lot about this kind of middle ground of curation and collaboration and coordination and all these kind of co-words. The Latin root for co is together, and we're going to see a lot of this kind of co-evolution happening here, and a lot of people doing a lot of this co-space rather than just purely the self-facing space. Okay, so let's talk about the consumption side of things here. And when I think about the consumption side, I always like to start with what is the optimal outcome that we want here. And when I think about the optimal outcome, I think about something similar to the Matrix, where you kind of plug the internet into your brain and you essentially experience a scaffolded flow state of the perfect learning that you want at any given point in time. You're just like, ooh, delicious learning, delicious learning, delicious learning, so fast. That's the goal. And when you think about that goal, the metric of that is something like valuable information over time, and that's very related to a lot of the work in information theory and ways to essentially optimize for given information per given time. So that's kind of the optimal world that I think about. And before kind of diving into the blockchain side of things, in thinking about this optimal world, I've kind of done a lot of this curation and a lot of this consumption stuff on the music side, where I was essentially trying to optimize for the best music and the most new music that I could. And the way that I did that, one of the big ways, was by thinking about this 2D map called Every Noise at Once, created by Glenn MacDonald at EchoNest, which is the data arm essentially of Spotify. And this Every Noise at Once map is an algorithmically generated map by Spotify that has 1,500 different genres on it on a 2D plane, and with that 2D plane you can essentially use that as a starting point to kind of dive into music. So you can say, wow, for someone like me, I was able to take that 2D plane and use it as the starting point for this kind of scientific playlist folder system that I use with inputs and outputs in order to optimize for the most new music at a given point in time. I think about it also like deal flow, where you say, hey, I want to have the best, if I'm a venture capitalist, I want to have the best deal flow for any given period of time. I want to have really high quality deal flow. That's essentially what we're looking for in this space. When you're a venture capitalist, there's so many different startups that are out there. When you're a music consumer, you got 5,000 albums uploaded to Spotify a week. You have 12 minutes of music uploaded to YouTube and SoundCloud a minute. There's so much noise. What is the signal? And that's the question that we're kind of trying to answer in this consumption of blockchain space. So when we think about that, I think we have to think from a couple different layers. We have to think at the information layer, and then we also have to think about the UX layer, and we have to think about both those layers kind of through time, aka the scaffold. So when we think about the information layer, I think about it kind of as, I think about the information layer as first when we think about how to divide information, I think that we need to essentially say what is to start with a macro perspective around how are you viewing that information. There's so many different frameworks with which one can view life, and the question is, which framework are you viewing life through right now? And so I'm imagining something where you can say, hey, I'm speaking from a Y perspective right now, and from that Y perspective, I'm looking to decentralize the world. And things that would exist in that bucket would be stuff like Ethereum and EOS and Tezos and these new smart contract platforms that are trying to do that. So that is kind of if you're using the why, how, what framework, that's the macro framework that you're operating in. The bucket that you're operating within that framework is the Y bucket, and then within that Y bucket, you're specifically talking about a given decentralizing the world thing, and the things that would exist there would be a bunch of things that are trying to do that. So I like to think about this kind of perspective through which you're viewing reality. Another version of this, which is also could be done, is something like a lean canvas for blockchain, where you imagine, okay, we're specifically right now we're thinking about the customer segment for curation markets. Okay, well that customer segment could be a bunch of people who exist in the r/meme economy thread because they're already buying and selling memes for karma. Let's have them do that except with tokens. So that's another way that you could say, hey, here's the system through which we're viewing the world, which is a lean canvas. And given that system, we're going to talk about the early adopter customer segment box. So I think that this kind of information bucketing is going to be kind of key for us going forward, where we're going to say, what is the framework through which you're viewing the world? Put that at the beginning. What is the bucket that you're talking about? Put that next. And then what is the actual thing that you're talking about? Put that third. So I want to kind of use this system as a way to change the language that we use around the information that is presented. And I think that this could have some pretty big impacts. And like for me, a easy good example of this is something like universal basic income, where the idea itself is relatively a little bit crazy, but what's not crazy is that automation and AI induced automation is going to have a big impact on our lives in the next 20 years. And whether you want to solve it through something like universal basic income or through education or through platform cooperatives, I don't really care. And I think that there should be a way to say that UBI is an automation solve. And so that's just a way to say, to bucket the information and to combine things like UBI and platform co-ops and something like education as solutions, in the lean canvas sense, to a macro problem, which is AI and automation, the creative destruction externalities. So that's on one side is the information, and I think that we need to essentially layer our information in a better way such that we can know the lenses that we're viewing the information through. The second piece here is the actual UI and UX that exists on top of that information layer. So after you have an information layer that has, hashtag Y, hashtag decentralize the world, hashtag EOS or whatever, after you have that, the question is, how do you produce that information to the user? And this is something that in the blockchain space, I think we have a big issue with, which is you have a lot of people talking about, the UX within the blockchain space is so hard. And I also know a lot of friends that want to get into blockchain, but are UI UX designers, and they don't have kind of a GitHub. There's no GitHub for designers, and so they don't have that same kind of platform and existing ecosystem that they can just as easily jump into blockchain with. So because of that, I'm thinking a lot about kind of, what are the ways that we can leverage the crowd to create UI and UX experiences on top of the information layer? And I think there's a lot of different versions of this, and design is very, very complicated, and I know very little about it, but some things that come to the top of my mind are, one, using kind of 2D visuals as our first 2D visuals and graphs as some of the early adopters. So this is people like, Max Roser in the World of Data. There's people like Nikki Case. There's people like, a lot of the people who are creating Matt Daniels and like the Pudding Dat Cool. I think there are a lot of people that are working in good space here where they're creating new kinds of visualizations. And I think that kind of open sourcing or crowdsourcing those visuals could be a good thing. Another one that's an easy example here for the UI UX layer is something like the Lean Canvas, which already has kind of a 2D representation of its space, and it's essentially a framework through which to view the world, and you can imagine that as being the framework that people consume the information through. The other things I think about here are stuff like, is there a lot of people in the blockchain space like Linda Xie or Nick from The Control. I think that they make a bunch of these tables that are like essentially difference tables, and I think that you can imagine new versions of difference tables that would be kind of ripe for new kinds of UI consumption here. So given that, I want to essentially, you have all these different kinds of UI and UX consumption, and it would be, what we want to do is incentivize the creation of both the UI UX layer and the information layer. And so kind of from the UI UX layer, or let's start from the information layer actually. So when I think about the information layer, part of the issue is that as people are going through the world, people are optimized to use early adopter customers as people that have higher importance and higher money and higher time for a given job to be done. What I mean by that is like, hey, you can either go with this person who's new to blockchain, who's just not going to pay you very much money probably, and maybe is not even that interested in it, or you might go to this person who's way deep in on it, and they know so much about it, and they're willing to pay money because they're already deep in the space. So given that kind of issue there, or that kind of natural state of things, I think that we need to essentially incentivize a way to create this scaffold. And the way that we can incentivize that is by saying, hey, I'm going to create something for people who are more beginners, and as those beginners go deeper into the space, when they consume my UI, or when they consume my information or my UI UX, then I will get, I don't get anything at the time because I can't pay for it, they don't want to pay for it. But over time, I essentially get a future on their future value creation. So I, as a person, get a bunch of start learning, delicious learning. I'm not paying anybody money for that, but then over time, once I start to actually make money and get to the value creation stage rather than just the consumption stage, I essentially give money back to the people who created the systems that were good for me. So I think that's one way to do things, is to directly incentivize it through essentially self coins and futures on a given self. I also think that another way to incentivize the information layer or the UI UX layer is through essentially forcing it through these little micro interactions. So in the blockchain space, we talk a lot about microtransactions, but I also think we should think more about micro interactions. And the best example of this is reCAPTCHA, which is a system that's used whenever you say you're not a robot. And when you say it, you're either picking out cars from a LiDAR kind of self-driving car screen, or you are typing in words that a Google Translate the machine couldn't translate. So you're essentially giving reinforcement learning for the machine learning algorithm that says, hey, I wasn't able to determine what this was. What is this human? And you're essentially both proving that you're a human because you know that a robot couldn't do it, and you're helping digitize all the books, and you're also helping the machine learning algorithms. So that is a thing that is currently used in kind of the machine learning space, but I also think it can be used within this kind of scaffolding space. And I think about it as as someone is going through society, consuming information from the internet, it would be nice if they left a trail behind them around what is the most important stuff to kind of read. And I think about it, there's this concept called stimmergy, and you can think about kind of like a bunch of ants that are all kind of moving throughout the world, and as they move throughout the world, they're leaving behind trails that tell future ants where to go. So that's kind of how I think we should think about this, which is as you're learning, you're also leaving a scaffolding behind yourself for others to follow in your learning path. And I think a good example of this, which just happened recently, is myself on Twitter. I was doing some research for some of this reverse ICO stuff, and on one of those articles, Trent kind of started the scaffold by saying, hey, Trent from Big Chain TV, he said, hey, this article is very similar to these 5 other articles. And then but he didn't actually put the links there. Then I put all the links there, and then after putting all the links there, the original writer of the article then added those links back to the article, which were not there initially. So that's essentially a way that the three of us combined to say, hey, we're part of this general ecosystem. This is, this most recent article is part of this series of articles, and let's add those series of articles to the original post. And it happened in this way that, I personally didn't know about all the articles that Trent referenced, and I personally couldn't edit the Medium article, but as a result of the three of us working together, we kind of left a scaffold for future people who are interested in the reverse ICO concept. Cool. So that's on the consumption side. We want to create information. We have to think about the information layer, also the UI UX layer, and then ways to incentivize people behind us to essentially consume information. Ways to incentivize people so that as they're moving through the information stream, the fire hose of information, that they're leaving behind paths so that people can more easily consume that information. So that's on one side of things. And let me say one other thing on that actually before I transition, which is, and we can see kind of the sadness in this space right now with something like, it's not like we have a Khan Academy or a Lynda or something like that. Those are kind of the classic ways that people, if they want to get scaffolded into a space, they will consume audio-visual content from the internet that's in a direct order in order to do that. And right now, the internet from a blockchain perspective is still non-scaffolded, essentially. There's no Lynda, there's no Khan Academy for it, and I think that we can create a Lynda or Khan Academy for it, but I think that we can create it through Stemmergy as a decentralized mesh. Okay, so now talking about the creation side of things, what I want to talk about on the creation side of things essentially is, this new concept that, should we really just be thinking about creation, or does more of the value chain go up into this coordinating, curating, collaborating space here? And the reason why I think about this is, mainly from like a minimizing waste perspective. I mean, you see all these different, my favorite example of this is all the different ICO trackers and all the different ICO aggregators. And there's so many different ones, and there's not much collaboration happening or interoperability happening between all of them. And so, for me, the only thing that kind of groups all of them together is this this Google spreadsheet that William Mugiar has around that essentially lists all of them that anybody can edit, that anybody can comment on. So it is to say that I think there's a lot of waste in this space here, and that a lot of people, now that we as a community are optimized not for dollars for self, but rather optimized for outcomes for everybody, we can start to think about minimizing waste in a more kind of coordinating, collaborating way. So when I think about that, I think about what we want from a value perspective. And when you think about what we want from a value perspective, there's one version which is, and actually what we want exists on a gradient. And so what we want exists on a gradient, and let me define the two ends of the gradient, which is essentially what we don't want. And so on one end of the gradient, what we don't want is where you actually went out and you created value for the board. And you're like, oh my God, I created this awesome new ICO tracker thing, and you didn't actually get any money back for creating that value. That would be sad. There's another version of reality where which is also bad, which is where you don't create any value for the world, where you're actively you didn't put any value out there, but you got value back. You're like, well, I wasn't even I didn't do any kind of ICO tracker thing, but I'm somehow like making a lot of money off it. So those are kind of two bad ends of the spectrum of like, you're outputting lots of value, getting no money back in, or you're outputting zero value, but getting lots of money back in. Neither of those make much sense, but there's kind of a better version of reality where you're kind of, aware of, creating value, and getting money, creating value, getting money back for it, but it's not hyper siloed, and it's also not hyper copyable and distributed. So I think about this also as, that's from the want perspective, from the value for value perspective, but I also think about it of like, what is the reality of the situation? And those two ends of the spectrum didn't talk about the reality of the situation well, but neither does the current situation where it's all these direct value for value exchanges. Really, we're part of this more macro ecosystem, this more kind of co-evolution ecosystem, and this kind of complementary ecosystem where when people do things in the ecosystem, it provides value to everybody in the ecosystem. So my favorite example of this is on this concept of compliments and the iPhone as a as an ecosystem, and different apps being complements for other apps within that ecosystem. So when I created Angry Birds, that also that created more value for essentially the whole ecosystem as a whole, which then made it the case that, if I was creating a different app like a weather app, it was more likely that that weather app would be purchased because that person already had an iPhone as a result of Angry Birds. So essentially Angry Birds and the weather app, all apps are kind of complementary to each other. I think that we should think about more ways to more accurately define that relationship, essentially complementary economic relationships. So when I think about this, I think about essentially making a kind of a coin, which is a kind of a shared outcome coin, or a shared job to be done coin, or a shared goal coin, or a shared metric coin. And so the way that this would work is, let's use a specific example here, like the iPhone one. So you can imagine, and this is already existing in various ways. So with the iPhone one, you can imagine a thing where I, as maker of Angry Birds, buy shares in Apple, and I, or other person as the maker of the weather app, also buys shares in Apple. And essentially, Apple is kind of the shared ecosystem coin, where both of us are trying to make apps more of a thing. It's essentially Apple. The Apple stock is essentially a apps more of a thing coin. And when more apps are making things, because I make Angry Birds, that increases the value of Apple, and because the person who makes the weather app, that also increases the value of Apple. And so, being part of the ecosystem, we get value in return through the Apple shares, essentially. So that's kind of an existing example of this. There are other existing examples of this, like networks of consumption and creation, like the Let's Talk Bitcoin network, or Inside.com's newsletters, where they kind of bundle and kind of create ecosystems that exist together that then kind of increase the value and are complements with other parts of that ecosystem. I also think about something like consensus here, and there's this great piece by Julian Mancato recently about the future of venture capitalists, and a big thing that they can do is, for something like consensus is able to spend lots of time and money on essentially just creating open source software, and they don't get direct value back in exchange, but they create open source software that enables more people to build on top of Ethereum, and then because they own Ethereum, that when the price of Ethereum increases as a result of their open source software, they get value back in return. So that's kind of Ethereum is a kind of this shared coin that I'm talking about. But I'd like to think more about other kinds of shared coins, and specifically shared coins around outcomes, because that's what we're thinking a lot about these days, not just money for self, but outcomes for the world. And when you think about these outcomes, it reminds me a lot of the work that a lot of people on the social impact side are doing, where, talking with Raphael from Alice SI, part of the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition, he's talking about, for him, not only does he have to, measure and track kind of classic dollar for dollar outcomes, but he also has to track, other outcomes like, what about what was the quality of life that was increased for the homeless population that they served? That kind of tracking, that outcome tracking, is something that doesn't exist quite as much on the kind of more traditional dollar side, but is going to exist a lot more as we start to attach dollar amounts to specific outcomes. And so when we think about these outcomes, there's not much infrastructure right now that exists around aggressively tracking outcomes that is then tied back into the monetary system. And so, we have things like randomized control trials and things like A/B tests, which are the start of this. But I think that we're going to see a lot more infrastructure built around this outcome space. So thinking about this outcome space, let's give an example to talk about how these coins could be created. So let's use the example from before around ICOs and the ICO aggregators. And let's say that they get together and they make a coin called the, Great ICO Info coin. So that Great ICO Info coin is their goal. That's what they're all trying to do together. And you can imagine a couple different ways that they can create this token, this coin. So one way is essentially a curation market for outcomes. And that's from this recent blog post called Social Impact Coins. And the idea is that, you buy into the, Great ICO Info coin at the beginning at a low price. And you also, if you're part of this ecosystem, you even inject more money into it. And you essentially give money to this social, to the coin itself, and that coin has a smart contract associated with it called the motivator. And so that motivator, what it does is at the beginning, it if the outcome increases, so let's say more and more people are really excited by the awesome ICO, great ICO content that they're getting, then as that metric increases, the motivator will buy back coins from the market. And when they buy back coins, it increases demand, which increases price. And so that's essentially saying, okay, you got it at the beginning at a low dollar amount, and then you've done great work, and you've increased the outcomes in this space. Nice work. You can now sell your coins at a higher dollar amount because you've created good outcomes. So that's kind of one version of this, which is this motivator and the social impact coins, which is very connected to a lot of this kind of curation market continuous token issuance space. Another version of this, which I also really like, that doesn't connect outcomes to the price of a token, but rather connects outcomes to the issuance of a token. So this one is one like Solar Coin, where when you create create solar energy for the world, when you have a solar panel on your roof, you both get money for, let's say you sell it to someone, or you are actively using it in your house or whatever, but you also get Solar Coin for it. And so you essentially get coins associated with a given outcome. And so with something like the Great ICO Info Coin, if you created something that then had a great outcome, you would get more coins that were associated with that. So if you said, oh man, I just created this new site or added this new, plugin that allowed us to kind of interoperate with all the ICO stuff, boom, then that gives you more coins essentially for doing good work in that space. So those are kind of two versions of things that we can do to create these, to create and kind of show the value that exists in the in-between area. And then the other thing I like to think about here is, well, what do we do with, is there a way to kind of, we've talked about some of the individuals here, but what about the people who exist in the middle who are actually doing the actual like coordination? And I like to think about for something with this coin amount is you can imagine someone like the motivator, there being kind of like a nonprofit associated with it, or sort of a similar thing with like Solar Coin where, you can kind of either add a transaction tax to yourself, kind of like resilience and crypto UBI stuff, or kind of add a beneficiary to people that are operating in the space, kind of like a curation club. And as you do that, you're essentially giving money to the ecosystem, to the shared goal. And when you give money to the shared goal, then you can then imagine spending that money in a DAO style way, or maybe in a foundation style way, where you say, great, we're going to spend this money on increasing the space generally and being here in the middle ground, in between this kind of co-evolution, in between the collaboration and competition. So I think that'd be a pretty exciting thing to happen, and I think that there is, there's examples of this already. Something like Pledge 1% in the startup world is an example of this, where you essentially take self-imposed tax yourself and say 1% of our earnings and our equity will go towards back to the community and back to the good, because they were a big part of this. They helped us here. They were part of our employees' happiness, blah, blah, blah. Let's give money back to the community. And something like my Patreon and kind of the self-imposed income cap is another version of this, where I say, you know what, things that help me out, I'll give money to Give Directly's UBI study because it's a great thing. It's a compliment for me, because if they succeed, then I'll succeed more. And I think they're doing great work and are part of this ecosystem. So these are ways that we in this space can essentially create outcome coins. And when we think about these create the coins, and then there's the coin creation side and the coin value side, and there's the kind of decision-making side and the foundation or DAO that's associated with this kind of coordinating all the players side. So given that, we talked about some of the things that could exist in this space, like the ICO aggregator, BTC and ETH, Bitcoin and Ether are essentially, I would relate them to essentially shared outcome coins for the crypto space generally. So if you buy in on those, you're essentially saying, you know what, I'm into the space generally. And if, as Zuko said at the beginning, if Zcash increases their price and does well, or if Tezos does, well then the whole ecosystem is probably going to go up, and Bitcoin might go up too. So they're kind of existing ones for the crypto space generally. You can imagine something like EOS and Tezos and Ethereum getting together on kind of like a smart contract platform coin. You can also imagine some things like a podcast coin, where people are trying to get aligned over distributing awesome information to the world. They kind of get in on that coin together. So that's what I think about here. And I want to say one final thing on it before we kind of transition here, which is that something I like about it is it, by its nature, it starts to negate the creative destruction externalities and diminish the creative destruction externalities. And what I mean by that is, if there are two people who have a shared job to be done, and let's say I'm a truck driver, and let's say this other person is a robot, a self-driving truck. Both of us have the same goal, which is taking the goods from one place and putting them into another place. And if we both control some of this coin, well then, even if I'm a truck driver, and as the self-driving trucks start to take my job and do a really good job at driving the stuff from Phoenix to Denver or whatever, I am part of their success. That I am not just totally without a job, totally without a meaning, whatever, but I kind of am part of the more macro success around this goal that both myself and the robot kind of share in. So I think it's a good way to, for the big companies like Uber and Google or whatever, to essentially push coins into the shared job to be done, and then allow the people who are part of that shared job to be done, that shared goal and the shared outcome, to kind of take part in the success. Okay, so in this final section here, I want to talk about, just give an example of some of the possibilities that could exist if we start to incentivize this kind of coordination and collaboration piece more. And with the example that I want to give is not with the ICOs, because I don't know quite as much about ICO aggregation, but I do know a lot about, or I know more about podcasting. And, I think about essentially the kind of pseudo-sadness that exists in the world today, which is you have so many different kinds of communication that are happening. And I'm just going to use the blockchain space as an example. And you have people that are talking one-to-one. In secret, you have people that are talking one-to-one on a podcast, doing an interview. You have people who are doing, who are part of these like mastermind groups, like the Proof of Stake group with Vlad and Vitalik and whoever, and they kind of talk about proof of stake and then spread that to the world. You also have groups like, people are doing a lot more remote talks, so I give kind of a crypto UBI remote talk to people around various meetups. So you have that. You also have these new conferences. You have both the classic old style of conference, which is, go to a given place and have a bunch of people talk. You also have this new style of conference, which is kind of this online conference, which is kind of similar to some of these like online remote talks, and it's kind of similar to an online kind of remote interview, but it kind of has the conference as a whole is there. So this is to say that I think that there's a lot of spoken content that is happening in the blockchain crypto space, and I think that there's room for coordination here and for collaboration here. And so what I think about is something where, and we don't want to duplicate work, and we also want to be part of this shared movement where we're kind of, as a whole, creating an awesome new podcast or, content network. So what I think about is just an easy first example of this is if we were able to create something like a, great crypto podcast coin, and when you create that coin, people start to, give money to that coin, and once that coin has money in it, we can then spend that on essentially collaborating the ecosystem through something like I think about something like a kind of a stable matching algorithm for creators, for content creators and podcast interviewers, and then projects that want to be interviewed. So you have a bunch of people in the space who are interviewing all kinds of projects. And it would be nice if there was a shared kind of Google Doc of all the people that wanted to do podcast interviews. They're like, oh, I'd love for you to be on my show. And on the other side, you had a bunch of people that were looking to be interviewed. So it's like, hey, I'm a new project in the space. I'd love to be interviewed. And then you can imagine running a Gale Shapley stable matching algorithm, which is one that they use in the to match hospitals and residences and doctor like the new residents. And essentially doing that in this podcast space would allow kind of a market optimized version where you say, hey, we as a podcast community are getting the best matches, as judged by ourselves in our priority lists for the people in this space. And we were able to create the spreadsheet and to create new content and to kind of coordinate around this spreadsheet because we're all kind of incentivized by the shared furthering of the space. So that's just an example of some of the things one example of a small thing that I'd be excited by as people get more into this kind of shared outcome space. Cool. So with that said, to kind of wrap up here, we talked a little bit about blockchain culture and technology and how it's kind of a self-reinforcing loop and how we are less about centralization of things like money and more about decentralization, which is very connected to income inequality and making the world a more equitable place. And as part of that, also being this transition away from a world of scarce capital, so we can actively kind of self-tax ourselves to give more money back to the system. And when we start to give more money back to the system, we can incentivize new ways to kind of consume information in a way such that we kind of, as we go through the system, we scaffold others into the system. And on the creation side, where as we're moving in the system, we kind of have shared outcomes with people who are also working in the same space as us, and we can kind of collaborate and co-evolve and compete together in order to create this shared outcome. So that's something that I'm excited by. If you want to learn more about me, you can go to patreon.com/rhysundmark. That's /RHYSLINDMARK. You can also support me there. I'll also have a exciting announcement coming soon. And then finally, if you want to check out I have a bunch of links that are connected to these podcasts. So there's a big, this one especially has a big scaffold around all the different links that I used for this talk and ways that people can get into the space more easily. So with that, thank you so much for your time and hope you're doing well. Bye.